Imagine being told to hand over your savings. Not asked. Told. And if you refused, if you held on to what had been legally yours just weeks before, you could face fines, federal prosecution, or prison. This actually happened. In America. Not under occupation. Not under authoritarian rule. Under a president most Americans still consider one of the greatest who ever lived. And the people who complied never got back what they gave up. Not really. Not ever. Stay with this, because the way it happened matters as much as the fact that it did. To understand what happened, you have to understand what money meant before it happened. For most of American history, the connection between money and gold wasn't abstract. It was physical. Gold coins circulated. People held them, saved them, passed them to their children. Paper currency, when it existed, was understood as a claim on something real, something the government was obligated to produce on demand. That relationship had a specific consequence. It meant there was something standing between political necessity and the printing press. A limit. And that limit wasn't just a technicality. It was structural, constitutional even, in the minds of many Americans. It meant that if you earned $1, you could, in theory, walk into a bank and demand the gold behind it. That power wasn't always exercised, but it existed, and its existence constrained what governments could do in moments of crisis, because you can't print gold. And in the early 1930s, that limit was becoming a serious problem for the people in power. The Great Depression had arrived with a force no one had fully anticipated. Banks were failing. Unemployment was climbing toward levels that felt like the edge of social collapse. People who had done everything right, saved, worked, built something, were watching it dissolve. By 1933, nearly a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed. Thousands of banks had closed their doors permanently. Depositors had lost billions, and they were doing what people always do when they stop trusting institutions. They were holding on to what felt real. Gold. Withdrawals were accelerating. People were converting paper dollars into gold coins, gold certificates, anything tangible they could keep close, which created a cascading problem. The more gold left the banks, the weaker the banks became. The weaker the banks became, the more people wanted their gold. A spiral, getting tighter. The Federal Reserve was constrained. Under the rules of the gold standard, it couldn't simply expand the money supply without the gold to back it. Every dollar of credit had a ceiling, and that ceiling was made of something you could hold in your hand. Something had to break it. The new president, barely weeks into office, had decided what that something was. April 1933. Franklin Roosevelt had been in office for just over a month. He signed an executive order, and with that signature, it became illegal for most Americans to hold gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates in any significant quantity. Citizens were required to surrender their gold to Federal Reserve banks. In exchange, they received paper dollars at a fixed government rate. No negotiation. The justification, hoarding gold, was strangling the recovery. The sacrifice was necessary. The language implied it was temporary. Penalties for non-compliance included heavy fines and up to 10 years imprisonment. 10 years for holding property that had been legal to hold 30 days earlier. Most people complied, because most people, when the government speaks with that kind of authority in that kind of moment, do. They stood in lines. They handed over coins that had been in their families for generations. Coins with weight, with history, and they accepted paper in return. Now here's the part that gets quietly skipped over. Once the gold was collected, the government revalued it. Before the order, the official price had been set at roughly $20 per ounce. After ordinary Americans had surrendered their holdings at that rate, the government raised the official price to $35 per ounce. In a single legislative act, the value increased by roughly 70%. The people who had been compelled to sell received no adjustment. The government, now holding the gold, absorbed the entire gain. Citizens surrendered an asset under legal compulsion. The government immediately increased that asset's official value. The profit went to the institution that had compelled the surrender. Think about the mechanics of that for a moment. The sequence was, compel the transfer, then increase the value. In that order, deliberately. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 made it official. The new price was codified into law. What had been taken at $20 was now officially worth $35. The difference, hundreds of millions of dollars in 1934 terms, went to the Treasury. This isn't fringe history. The mechanics are a matter of public record. What's remarkable is how rarely it gets described plainly. And then the promise of return quietly disappeared. Private gold ownership in significant quantities remained restricted for decades. It wasn't until 1974, more than 40 years later, that Americans regained the legal right to own gold freely. 41 years. By then, the generation that had surrendered their coins was old. Many were gone. The gold had passed through decades of government hands, through the post-war financial architecture, through a new global monetary system, and into a world where the dollar's last formal connection to gold had been severed entirely. The gold was never returned. What came back, eventually, was the right to buy it again, at whatever price the market now demanded. In 1933, gold was $20 an ounce. By the time the restriction lifted in 1974, it was over $180. The math does not favor the people who were forced to sell. There's something else worth understanding. Removing gold from private hands didn't just change what Americans could own. It changed what money could become. With gold no longer circulating, no longer held by ordinary people as a practical constraint on currency expansion, the limits on the money supply loosened in ways that compounded across decades. Each crisis produced new tools. Each new tool increased the distance between money and anything it had once been anchored to. The New Deal required spending. The war required spending. The post-war order required spending. And spending, once you've removed the physical constraint, becomes a matter of political will more than material limit. The Bretton Woods system, built in 1944, tried to preserve some vestige of the old discipline. Under that system, the dollar was still nominally tied to gold. Other currencies were tied to the dollar, but the architecture was already strained. The government's gold supply could not keep pace with the dollars being printed and deployed across a growing post-war economy. And by 1971, the last formal connection between the dollar and gold was cut unilaterally, without warning, without any mechanism for ordinary people to object. A line runs directly from April 1933 to August 1971. It doesn't bend. Step back and look at the shape of what happened. A crisis arrives, real, severe, undeniable. In the urgency of that crisis, the government acquires new authority over something fundamental: property, currency, the basic instruments of private security. The measure is framed as temporary. It is not temporary. The authority becomes the foundation for the next expansion. Each step justified by what preceded it, each one building on the architecture that came before. The language shifts slightly each time, but the structure is identical. Emergency declared, authority transferred, asset acquired, value reassigned. And then, quietly, the emergency becomes the new normal. What ordinary people are left with at the end of the sequence is a diluted version of what they started with. Not nothing, never quite nothing, just less. Less purchasing power, less insulation from decisions made far above them, less of the finite, holdable thing that once stood between their savings and institutional necessity. This is not a conspiracy. It requires no secret coordination. It only requires that the people making decisions during crises act in the interest of the system they are trying to save. And that the system they are saving is not the same system ordinary people think they're part of. The same logic surfaces every time the system faces stress it cannot absorb through ordinary means. 2008, the financial system approached the edge of collapse, not because of anything ordinary depositors did, but because of decades of compounding risk taken by institutions that understood the implicit guarantee beneath them. Which institutions would be backstopped and whose losses would be absorbed by the public was decided in a weekend, in rooms most people never entered, with no meaningful public input. Institutions that had privatized their gains for a decade socialized their losses over a weekend. The people who lost homes, jobs, and retirement savings were not in those rooms. What they received was a recovery that, by most measures, returned the financial sector to health far faster than it returned the median household. The mechanism was different from 1933. The shape was the same. The pandemic response. Trillions created and deployed at a speed that would have seemed impossible before it happened, with consequences for purchasing power that are still working through the economy. In less than 2 years, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet more than doubled. The money did not appear from savings. It was created. And like all newly created money, it found its way into prices. Grocery prices, housing prices, the cost of things ordinary people could not avoid buying. The people who held assets, stocks, real estate, anything with a claim on productive capacity, saw those assets inflate. The people whose primary asset was their paycheck watched its purchasing power erode. Quietly, persistently, without a single law requiring it, without anyone being required to explain it plainly. Government-issued digital currencies are no longer theoretical. Several countries have already implemented them. The architects of others are open about the appeal. Programmable money that can be tracked, restricted, or in some designs, made to expire. Money that loses value if not spent within a defined period. Money that cannot be used for certain categories of purchase. Look at this closely. Money that can be paused, for any holder, for any reason, at the discretion of the issuing authority. The technology makes possible what the 1933 order required police and courts to enforce. The specific tools change. The underlying logic doesn't. When the system needs something, from your savings, from your behavior, from your compliance. It finds a mechanism, and the mechanism is always framed as protection, stability, recovery, safety, progress. The words change too. The direction doesn't. The people who handed over their gold in 1933 were not naive. They were frightened. They trusted that the emergency was real, that the sacrifice was shared, that the system they were sustaining would sustain them in return. Some of that trust was warranted. Some of it was not. What they couldn't see, what people inside any system rarely can, is how permanent temporary tends to become. How the architecture built in crisis quietly outlasts the crisis. How authority granted in urgency rarely returns to where it started. The gold they surrendered helped finance a transformation of American money so complete that their grandchildren grew up unable to imagine the world before it. Unable to imagine currency as something tangible, something finite, something that belonged to them in a way no executive order could reach. That world is gone, and right now decisions are being made about what money is, how it moves, who controls access to it, and under what conditions it can be restricted. That will define the financial reality of the next generation. Those decisions are not being made by you. They are not being made with you in mind. They are being made with the same logic that has always governed these moments. That in a crisis, your compliance is more useful than your consent. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is whether you can see it happening. Most people will watch this and move on. If you're still thinking about it, you already know why.